Will you pray with me? Holy and gracious God, we seek your Spirit now upon this place. Surround us by your grace and speak to us through your Spirit. We might hear your word for us this day. In Jesus' name, amen. As I have said before, I am a big fan of the fantasy genre. In TV, movies, and books, if it has all the hallmarks of a good fantasy, I am in. That means I know what a good king looks like, or in some cases a good queen. They're usually strong and good in battle. They tend to take power reluctantly, but are sure of themselves by the time they ascend the throne. The best kings have good sidekicks, supporting characters that help to keep our sovereign grounded, have their own brand of wisdom, but not people who could challenge for the throne. And of course, they always win. It might take a while. Tolkien, after all, started the concept of a trilogy of books, but eventually a good fantasy king or queen has a happy ever after, leaving the reader or viewer assured that all will be well as the tale draws to a close. From Aragon to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, to the Pensive Children, once a king or queen of Narnia, always a king or queen of Narnia, these characteristics of rulers are nearly universal in the fantasy genre. Today is Christ the King Sunday, a chance to consider again what it means to say that Jesus is a king, and interestingly, the Jesus in our gospel reading shares few or none of these characteristics. His sidekicks have run away, and they don't have any wisdom anyway. The disciples in the Gospels are rather clueless throughout the entire time. He has refused to take up arms against his enemies. And at least in this Gospel passage, he seems to be losing. He dies on the cross. He is a crucified king, a king defeated by the empire, and a king who in this particular reading seems to have no throne to win. And this is something of a scandalous claim. We don't think so because we have 2,000 years of Christian theology and faith and tradition to get us here. But at the time, the concept of a king who was crucified, a king who was killed by the Empire of Rome, was scandalous and odd. It shouldn't have made sense. And yet the early church worshipped this crucified king. The early church proclaimed him Lord, and so have 2,000 years worth of followers. Part of that is because the early church understood something that we, 2,000 years later, sometimes have forgotten. And that is, Christ as King and Lord is a political statement. It's not a partisan statement, but it is a political statement. Because if Christ is Lord, if Christ is King, that means Rome is not. If Jesus is Lord, that means Caesar is not. If Jesus is Lord, that means the ways of Rome, the ways of the oppression, the ways that held power in the time of Jesus are not actually the ways whose power is most supreme, but the ways of God, the ways taught by Jesus Christ. To say Jesus is Lord is to declare an allegiance to the ways of Jesus intentionally counter to the ways of the ruling society of the day, the ways of Rome, the ways of the empire. So what are those ways that we see Jesus as King? The ways that we claim in our faith for 2,000 years. To begin with, to say Jesus is Lord is to say that is to proclaim a king who preaches forgiveness. How many times in our Gospels do we hear Jesus talk about turning the other cheek, or forgiving our enemies, or loving our enemies, or forgiving not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times, or forgiving those who have sinned against us, as we have been forgiven by God. Jesus, as a leader, as a preacher, as a king, is one who teaches us forgiveness. His kingship is rooted in that forgiveness and grace. And we find that even in the gospel passage this morning. There Jesus is dying on the cross, mocked by the crowds, mocked by the leaders, mocked by the guards, mocked even by one of the people being crucified with him. And yet he says, Father, forgive them. They don't understand. They don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them. Jesus is a king who forgives, a king who shows grace and mercy, a king who calls us to show grace and mercy. To call Jesus Lord is also to proclaim a God of love, a Lord of love. Again, we have countless examples in the Gospels. Jesus healing those who are crippled and ill. Jesus having compassion for those who were hungry and feeding them with fishes and loaves on the seashore. Jesus loving and caring for Pharisees and prostitutes and tax collectors and ordinary everyday folk. Jesus is the king who shows love as his defining characteristic, defining way he rules, defining way he lives. And again, we see this in the cross story. Jesus says, "Today I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." And I was preparing for this sermon, I had heard a concept that I loved immediately and had to share. You see, the you isn't specified. We usually assume that the you Jesus is talking to is the one thief, criminal, who asked Jesus to remember him. That's a pretty good reading, probably the most accurate reading of the text, truth be told. But what if that you was not meant to be just to one person, but to both criminals being hanged with him, maybe even to those people on the ground? After all, we know from the rest of our tradition that Jesus loved them. Jesus loved the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the church leaders. Jesus loved the disciples who were missing. Jesus loved the guards and even loved the Romans, but as he opposed their policies. It's not a stretch to think and imagine that Jesus might be saying to them, "Today you will be with me in paradise. You will know the love of God as I embody it. Today you are embraced by your Creator just as you are and loved just as you are. Today you are my beloved." Again, there's probably no evidence for this in the text, but it feels true to me about who Jesus was. Because Jesus was a king who shows love. One more piece about Jesus as King and Jesus as Lord. And that's Jesus as Lord is a king whose ways lead to new life. Because we know that this chapter is not the end of the Gospel of Luke. That the crucifixion is not the end of the story, but more awaits, that Easter awaits, that resurrection awaits. Jesus as Lord is to affirm that the ways of God, the ways taught by Jesus, are ways that lead to new life. That the powers of Rome, who seem to be victorious in the cross, will not be victorious. That the ways of this world that seem to have gotten Jesus down will not win. Because Jesus is more than just a crucified king. He's also a resurrected king. He's not just the Jesus of earth, but the cosmic Christ over all of creation. The Colossians reading this morning was read in part to remind us of that part about Jesus, and here's just a piece of it again for you. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven or on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. To say that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is King, is to affirm and remember the ways of God that lead to new life and the promise that death itself is not the end of our story. This is the one case in which the story of Jesus has a bit of that fantasy genre feel. Because this is the happily ever after. Except we're not there yet. We haven't reached the happily ever after because we still have work to do here before reaching that time of eternity. Because the ways of Jesus Christ are not only the ways of the future, but the ways that begin new life now. The ways of showing love and forgiveness, of caring for others, of working for God's justice. The ways of Jesus, our crucified King, our resurrected King. So on this Christ the King Sunday, I will not affirm to you that Jesus is like the fantasy genre king, because it doesn't quite work that way. I love fantasy, but that's not who Jesus is. We are given a different king. A crucified king, a resurrected king. A king who shows forgiveness, who shows love, and invites us to do the same for the world that needs it. A king who promises us that the ways of God are the ways of new life, today and forevermore. That's a king I'm willing to follow. Thanks be to God. Amen.